Hello, dear students. Welcome to the Odyssey of virtual learning. Let us start our journey by reading working capital. In my previous sessions, we had already read what is working capital. Working capital is the fund required for meeting the day to day expenses of the business, which is classified as gross working capital and net working capital. We know gross working capital is the capital invested in total current assets of the business concern, and net working capital is the excess of current assets over current liabilities. And if the current asset exceeds the current liabilities, then we say it is positive working capital. And if the current liabilities are more than the current assets, then we say it is negative working capital. Now let us read the various factors which helps in determining the amount of working capital requirement or the amount of working capital required by a business concern. The first factor is length of the operating cycle. The amount of working capital directly depends upon the length of the operating cycle. Operating cycle basically refers to the time period which is involved in production. It starts right from the acquisition of raw materials and end when you make or when you receive the payment regarding the sales. The working capital is very important for smooth functioning of or smooth flow of the operating cycle. If the length of the operating cycle is long, then more working capital is required. And if the length of the operating cycle is short, then working capital requirement is less. Next is nature of business. It is nothing but the type of the business the firm is involved in. Okay. In case of a trading concern or a retail shop, the requirement of working capital is less because the length of the operating cycle is short. But in case of a manufacturing or a wholesaler, first in case of a wholesaler is required to keep more of the working capital because he needs to maintain larger stock of goods. And in case of manufacturing companies, it also requires more of the working capital because they have to convert the raw materials into finished goods, sell them on the credit. Normally they sell them on the credit. They need to maintain inventory for the continuous production to continue, and for this reason they need more of the working capital. Next is scale of operation. The scale of operation also decides the amount of working capital. If the business is operating on a larger scale of operation, more working capital is required, and if it is small scale of operation, the business requires less working capital. Next is business cycle fluctuations. During boom period, the market is flourishing. So there is more demand, there is more production, there is more debtors, which means more working capital is required. Whereas during depression, the demand is less, inventories are required to be maintained in less quantities, there will be less debtors, so less working capital is required. Next is seasonal factors. Now, what is the seasonal factors? Normally, the business which uh, sells the goods on the seasons, or basically sells the seasonal goods, require huge amount of working capital during the season because the demand is more. More stock has to be maintained and there will be fast supply. But in case of slack seasons or off seasons, the demand is less, so less working capital is required. And the working capital requirement is constant for the companies which are selling goods throughout the season. Okay. Next factor is technology and production cycle. Now, what is technology? If a company is using labor intensive technique to produce products, then the working capital requirement is definitely more. You know why? Because it needs to maintain enough cash flows for making payments to laborers. But if the company is using machine intensive techniques, the production requires less of the human capital. The human requirements are less. So less working capital is required. Next comes production cycle. If the production cycle is long, then more working capital is required because it will take long time for converting the raw materials into finished goods. And during that time, in order to continue the production, you need to have more working capital. But if the production cycle is less, then you can manage the business with less working capital. Then comes the credit policy of the firm. That means the credit terms or the credit allowed. Okay. So credit policy refers to average period for collection of sales proceed. It depends upon number of factors such as the credit worthiness of the clients, industry norms, etc. If a company is following a liberal credit policy, then it will require more working capital. Whereas if the company is following a credit policy which is very strict or which is short, then it can manage with less working capital. Next is credit avail. That means whatever credit you are getting from your suppliers of the raw materials. Now, if suppliers of the raw materials are giving long-term credit, then company can manage with less working capital. Okay. Whereas if suppliers are giving only short period credit, then company will require more working capital to make payments to the creditors. Then comes availability of raw materials. If raw materials are easily available and there is uh, just a moment, dear students, sorry for the interruption. If the raw materials are easily available and there is ready supply of raw materials and inputs, then the firm can manage with less amount of working capital. Okay, whereas if the supply of the raw material is not smooth, then the firm needs to maintain large inventory to carry on operating cycle smoothly. So more working capital is required. Next is growth and expansion of the business. That means if the firm is planning to expand their activities or there are some opportunities where the firm is required to make an investment with respect to expansion, and they need to increase the scale of production, which means more of the raw materials, more inputs, so more working capital. There are some other factors also, like changes in prices and changes in competition. In case of rising prices of the raw materials and labors, you need to have more working capital because you need to pay more for acquiring the raw materials and you need to pay more to the people who would be working for you. And in case of fierce competition, when the competition is very high, then you need to follow the policies, which many policies to have an edge over your competitors, so which definitely requires more of the working capital. So dear students, with this we come to an end to various factors which affects the requirement of working capital. We'll meet in my next video. Wait till then, have a nice day. Thank you.